Happy Wednesday and welcome to Breaking to Data. We're a community of accomplished data experts and professionals who share stories, industry knowledge, and advice, and different tips really breaking into the data industry. And we're really excited to have Jim Clute today, who is a product analytics manager at Reverb/Etsy, and he's bringing a lot of great experience in the industry with looking for different job positions in data and really trying to break into different roles here. So we're excited to have you, Jim. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Julia and Scott. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
So I think before jumping into anything, I just want to do my quick disclaimer that my HR told me I had to do. Is that on this call, everything I talk about is my own perspective and opinion, and I'm not speaking in any official capacity for Reverb or Etsy. Though I will say my opinion is that Reverb is a dope place to work, and Etsy seems to be a pretty dope parent company so far.
Very cool. Yeah. So I think maybe we'll get started by hearing a little bit of your experience and kind of your journey into the data world and yeah, where it's taken you.
Totally. So I've been working in kind of various data professional roles, mostly as a data scientist, but also as a data science and analytics manager, and various other things that are similarly related or similarly titled to that, for about 6 years after I left grad school. And Scott would yell at me if I didn't say that in grad school, my research was around non-invasive brain stimulation, and I have had absolutely no applications for that in my data professional career. Um, but I've definitely been able to kind of see a few different, I guess, things in the hiring process from both sides of the table, right? So I've been an individual contributor and have gone on dozens and dozens and dozens of interviews in the last 6 years, as well as being a hiring manager. So I've had the opportunity to interview people and help bring them into an organization. And I think there have definitely been some things that I wanted to call out. 'Cause I know that as folks who are kind of starting off in their data career, they have some red flags that they want to be on the lookout for. They may not know that some job postings are not necessarily the best job postings. So I'm going to start off with just a few kind of bullet pointed ideas of things that you might want to keep an eye out for as a job seeker for data professional careers. But yeah, we can definitely drill into any of them in more details as we chat a little bit deeper. So the first thing, you may have all heard about kind of postings that are looking for unicorn candidates or impossible
Mm.
candidates. So entry level positions that are looking for 10 years of experience with a piece of software that has only existed for 2 years. And you also have to be able to cook and everything under the sun, right? I did a quick search on LinkedIn for entry level data scientist positions. And in the top 10 unpromoted searches in Chicagoland, it looked like the average experience was about 7 years for entry level positions. So I understand that titles can mean different things at different organizations, and I'll talk about that in a second. But there are going to be roles where it's basically asking you to be an impossible person. And I think that that's often a red flag that the organization doesn't really know exactly what they're looking for, which, I mean, data professional careers and kind of data parts of organizations are still relatively new, especially in a
Mhm.
lot of industries. And so, having the opportunity to kind of figure things out as you go can be a perk for a lot of folks starting off in a data career. And these sorts of unicorn roles are often like that, figuring things out as you're going. But they often come with kind of outsized expectations along with them, and usually lack the kind of support system that would be really required to help you kind of grow and move into the next steps in your career. So, my first point to call out is if you see those unicorn positions, don't feel bad that you're not impossible. Maybe move on to something else. Related to that, the second point I wanted to call out is that titles can mean very different things at different organizations, right? So some organizations, places that Scott and I have been, like they call everybody a data scientist, regardless of seniority. Some places, after a quick cycle in your entry level position, they call everyone a senior data scientist after a couple of months of experience. So title can mean really, really different things at different organizations. So I really encourage you as you're looking for positions to try and make an effort to look into those responsibilities and the specific things that a position is asking you to do. Uh, Specifically, the things on the experience that they're looking for, but the tools that you've used is also relevant there. So just doing a title level search can be an easy thing and often a useful thing to do on a lot of the places that have job postings. But again, just make sure you're using a good filter there. Um, I think another thing to call out now that I'm mentioning the different places to look for positions. You might encounter ghost listings sometimes too, which is kind of my colloquial term for listings that don't actually have the possibility of leading to a job. Uh, One thing to be on the lookout for, or a way to identify these, is if you see the same listing posted literally 100 different places and it looks like you can see that listing has existed for a long time, it's plausible that some of these career boards are just reposting things, and they haven't had their systems updated in time. So
Mhm.
again, something to be on the lookout for, and have a good filter around when you're looking for these different positions. And I think one last thing I wanted to call out specifically, because I get asked about this often, is kind of what kinds of experience count when you're talking about different job applications. Like, oh, well, I did this as a side project. Oh, I did this in school. Is this something that is relevant? Does this count? And I think the specific language in the job posting can really clue you in on how careful you need to be and how specific you need to be.
Mm.
In my experience as a hiring manager, if I'm looking for someone with relevant experience, I really don't care if it came from a previous job, whether it came from a side project, school, as long as you're able to talk through it kind of with some coherence. That's really the important thing for me. Whereas some positions may say you need to have some amount of experience at a particular position in an industry or a particular organization of a particular size, probably less wiggle room there. But again, experience can mean different things to different people. And I think it's totally reasonable when you're kind of looking for roles to kind of not immediately discard something that's looking for experience beyond what you think you have because you've only worked in industry for a small amount of time. So um, that was me talking for a lot to lead things off. So I'm going to take a quick sip of water.
Yeah.
But yeah, any follow up questions?
No, that was great. I think we got a lot like packed into like 5 minutes. But yeah, I'd love to break that down a little bit. So I think it'd be good to start with maybe a question from the chat that we have that Yvette asked about maybe considering like working with a recruiter. Is that something that you'd recommend? Because you're talking about like ghost listings and this kind of frustration of going through these unicorn posts. Is a recruiter maybe a way to kind of skip some of that frustration?
Um, Sometimes it can be. So I think my experience working with recruiters, or at least most of my engagement with recruiters, and when I say recruiters here, I mean recruiters from like third party agencies who are either
Hmm.
contracted for a specific company or are trying to cultivate leads that they'll then work with other companies on. Um, those kinds of recruiters have been very hit or miss for me,
Mm.
mostly because like they're incentivized to fill the role. They're not incentivized to have a strong fit. And in a lot of cases, they're not incentivized for you to even stick around for some period of time. So I'll often get kind of things that are not good fits for me, things that it feels like a lot of those like looking for unicorn roles will come from those kind of third party recruiters.
Mhm.
I will say though, if you see a listing or some listings for positions that you're interested in or have organizations that you're interested in working with, and you can find recruiters or HR folks, hiring folks on LinkedIn. For those organizations or who are affiliated with those roles, that's a great thing to do. Anytime
Mhm.
you have an opportunity to make personal contact with someone who can impact your hiring decision, I think take that opportunity, reach out to that recruiter. That's literally their job, is to find people that could
Mhm.
be a good candidate. Worst case scenario, they won't respond. Best case scenario, they can either refer you to the right, like to the role you're interested in, or point you in the direction of another role, which I've had several times where I thought, hey, this might be a good fit for me. Contacted a recruiter for a data science position, and they said, hey, this team might not be the right role given your experience, but this other team might be somebody that you'd want to talk to. Let's talk to that
Mm.
recruiter instead.
Gotcha.
Hopefully that's a
So
helpful response.
yeah, no, that's very helpful. So your past experiences, have you gotten those through like kind of networking or job applications, recruiters? How's that kind of panned out in your experience?
Totally. Really, really good question. So it's been lucky and networking, I think are the two words to kind of sum that
Mm.
up. So I moved to Chicago in 2009 with the hope and dream of becoming an academic researcher studying non invasive brain stimulation. And
Hmm.
it turned out that that wasn't necessarily the path for me. But a friend of a friend in the graduate program I was in referred me for a role in data science, said that it might be an interesting position. I'd done some psychology research that was sort of relevant. And in the interview, I ended up talking a lot more about sports analytics with my soon to be boss than anything related to my graduate research, or really even anything related to the psychology research that I thought was germane. And so I think, like, kind of a quick takeaway from that is, if you have side hustles or side projects or things that you think are interesting, again, I mentioned earlier, that's relevant experience, and it is often, like, because it's something you're interested in,
Mhm.
the stuff that you can talk about with the most confidence and kind of the
Mm.
most excitement and enthusiasm, which still seems to get some hiring managers excited today. So, yeah, my first foot in the door, though, was really a friend of a friend, and was able to kind of get the position without really strong coding experience, uh, by talking about sports analytics, which I had been working kind of a side project through
Mhm.
grad school on. Uh, and it was, like I said, lucky and networking. I was very fortunate that the hiring manager was interested in sports analytics, so it worked out really well.
Very cool. Yeah, sometimes it just works out like
Oh,
that, which is, everyone gets into the industry in a different way. But I'd like to
Totally.
follow up on something you were talking about earlier about like how you look for experience in people's resumes, but it's not necessarily like job postings. Sometimes it's like projects, like your sports analytics project, I assume. But
Mhm.
yeah, so what kind of things do you look for when you see your resume with like more personal projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it really depends on the sorts of things that I'm trying to hire for a specific role. So, kind of relevant experience, I think, is kind of the broad kind of cop out answer. But to
Mm,
give a little bit more context about what I mean there. So, say I'm hiring for someone who we're looking for someone who can help us with search related problems, or actually, how about item recommendation problems? Because I think Scott and I have worked on problems in that vein before. Um, so in that case, we would make sure to have on the job posting that very explicitly we're looking for someone who has relevant experience
mm,
with item recommendations, not necessarily like specific experience at a specific organization or anything like that. With the hope that we would surface candidates who could at least say some kind of a project that they had worked on. What
mhm,
I would want to then drill into during the interview process, if there was anything in GitHub, or if they had published any like blog posts or anything like that, if saying it was like a side project, that would be awesome. I'd love to learn more about that, and that would kind of lead the follow-up questions. If it's another professional experience, then point me to that. Like, I like to, I don't know, as a hiring manager, I like to be able to engage with the things that people plan to talk about, so that I can kind of generate questions around it, and be able to understand like what they actually did. Uh, but yeah, anything that kind of fits into that relevant mold. So uh,
mm.
if the candidate thinks that it's something that even maybe I don't think at first blush is really relevant experience, if they can kind of make a case for why recommending, I mean, this is a totally toy example off the top of my head, why being able to recommend ice cream flavors or beer varieties to customers in kind of a customer service setting was relevant to their ability to design a recommendation system. Like, cool, if you can make a good case for that, great. Um, to those listening, I don't know that anyone would ever be able to actually make a good case for that, but just as a hypothetical example.
what about
Yeah.
But
beer
the thing,
flavored ice cream?
ooh, I
Yeah.
think that exists.
Oh, okay. Never
So
mind then.
yeah, yeah, good ideas have always happened, Scott, or have always already happened. Um, but yeah, I think like the most useful experience that I'm, or the experience that I'm looking for, again, is relevant to the role, and then something that I guess the candidate can talk through, feels like they have the ability to kind of explain at a level like appropriate for whatever position they're applying for. Oh,
Gotcha. So
Aaron
something where they
found the beer flavored ice cream for the chat.
can.
Oh,
Sorry.
Yeah.
and I have a one question I have is you talked about red flags to look for on job postings, but do you have any red flags to keep in mind during the actual interview process?
Oh, absolutely, yes, that's a great question. um, So it's astonishing to me how tuned out a lot of interviewers can actually be during an interview
Mm,
process. Uh, if you're not getting kind of just interpersonal respect from your interviewer, that is a red flag. So I think it's explicitly, or important to explicitly call out that sometimes organizations have bad culture and it flows down through the hiring process. So if you feel like you are not getting any kind of like the kind of engagement you ought to be getting during an interview, like that is clearly something that you should be looking out for. One, I think, data specific or data professional specific sort of thing to be on the lookout for. I hate, and this may be more of a pet peeve than anything else, but I think kind of data science textbook questions during the interview process are just awful,
Mm.
especially if they don't clarify that you're looking for kind of, or that it's kind of an open book or an open note sort of situation, right? Like, never in my professional career have I been working with a client or a colleague or someone who asked me to like recite a specific theorem or talk about like the bias variance trade-off in an unapplied setting, right? So uh, I've had a lot of interviews though where the initial screenings are like really basic textbook questions that they want a quick answer on the spot. And again, like my experience with with those organizations, that they just don't necessarily know what they're looking for in the role. They don't necessarily know what they're hoping to get out of someone, and that can make for a very bumpy trajectory onboarding and trying to grow within that kind of an organization.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes sense. But yeah, so kind of going back to one of the questions that was asked, VJ was asking about like in terms of like maybe data science versus data analytics roles. Like, do you look for like machine learning a lot or like statistics or kind of what kind of things do you prioritize per those different roles?
Totally. So I think to kind of get back to the previous answer a little bit, like it really depends on the role, which again it can vary a lot from title to title. So to talk about my specific experiences, the data scientists that we hire at Reverb definitely wear more than one hat.
Mm.
So if you think about larger organizations where they can kind of afford the human capital to specialize, and you'll have like very specific ML engineers and then data science teams and then data engineers and probably more titles than that too. Folks can be very specialized. Folks on our team have to be able to do lots of different things. So machine learning is not a huge priority for most of the projects that we're working on right now, though in the not terribly distant future, it's going to become an increasing priority. So I think that'll probably be something we try and hire for. Uh, Whereas like we need folks who are good at communicating to stakeholders of different kinds of technical abilities, being able to kind of put together different reporting tools and dashboards, but also be able to think about how to design experiments and analyze and run experiments. Contrast that with a data scientist at a different organization. They may be fully function or focused on machine learning and model evaluation and model calibration. And so like for me personally, for the roles that I'm usually looking for, it's more of that balance between, I guess, what folks would think is more of an analytics role, which is the reporting and kind of the working with the stakeholders sort of engagement, rather than focusing on the ML sides of things. But at other organizations, you're definitely going to see a broader mix. So I guess a piece of advice on that is like, do the things that you're interested in. There's a lot of machine learning focused careers out there. There's a
Mhm.
lot of kind of wearing multiple hats focused careers out there. I don't know that one necessarily is more likely than the other to get you a foot in the door, or kind of that entry level position, at least right now. That could change down the road. But yeah, like you can definitely start a career focusing entirely on ML, some combination, mostly on analytics.
Gotcha. It's interesting that you mentioned communication is something that's like very important to the role. How do you kind of like measure that in a candidate and like kind of why or how much of the job do you think is communication vital to that?
Oh yeah, that's a good point to call out. So um, my team primarily works. Our primary stakeholders are product managers, and again, product managers at most organizations I've been at have varying levels of technical background and technical expertise. They usually have very deep knowledge of the product or the product areas that they're working in, and so like in order to kind of communicate and collaborate effectively, my team doesn't need to just necessarily be able to explain technical things to technical stakeholders, because they need to do that. There are engineers in the product side of the business that we need to be able to engage with effectively. Um, but they also need to be able to talk more about kind of strategic things and more business focused areas rather than the technical or coding side of things with the product managers and product leadership. And so, like, The types of communication, I think, vary. One thing that I've noticed is like folks who have an academic background often are able to hit these different kinds of communication, like hit different audience or communicate effectively with different audiences because like they have to teach. Teachers are also very effective at this kind of communication strategy. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit now, but in any case, the like I can't think of a role where you're not going to have to communicate effectively with someone. But again, like whether that's going to be primarily technical communication or whether that's going to have to be some combination where you're going to have to be a little bit more nimble, really depends on the organization and the role. In my organization, it's a lot more of the latter where you have to kind of be able to quickly calibrate what you're saying to the audience at hand because it's going to vary a lot from audience to audience. But at other organizations, you may be able to like just have purely technical conversations.
Mhm.
And so, just like with the previous answer, like you can have a career doing all of the above, right? You don't have to kind of say, well, the only career for me is being able to do both. Like you don't have to do both. You can do it. You can have a career communicating technically, and that's totally fine. Yeah.
Yeah. I noticed that you also come from like an academic like research background as well, and you already kind of explained how you got your first job. But do you have any other tips for people who might be coming from that background as well, or something kind of unrelated, and being able to play to those strengths?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. So, people from academia, if you hear this, you are good enough. Industry is definitely very eager to have you join. You have terrific skill sets because you know how to teach yourself things. You know how to communicate to a lot of different audiences. You know how to think critically about problems. You know how to ask good questions. Uh, a really relevant skill, at least for my position right now, is kind of design and analysis of experiments. And in a lot of research positions in academic settings, like that's what you learn how to do. So the kinds of training that I think you get from kind of a research position in academia is very, very well suited to most of the kinds of work that I do in industry. And I think in terms of things that can kind of facilitate the transition, first, like again, imposter syndrome is real. And so I just want to make sure to explicitly say, people in academia, you're good enough. Like that's usually the biggest hurdle is getting them to think like, hey, I can function outside of academia, which has been my life up to this point. Um, Another thing that I think is really useful to call out is like diversity in a lot of different forms is a positive thing in organizations and in teams and settings and stuff. And in this case, I'm talking about kind of diversity of ideas and diversity of backgrounds. So my lab in Northwestern in grad school was uh, in communication sciences and disorders, which was kind of between psychology and cognitive science and neuroscience and linguistics. And so we had folks from all sorts of different areas working together. And it was really interesting to kind of get these different perspectives and kind of see how taking a fresh set of eyes to a problem or applying a fresh set of eyes to a problem that hadn't seen that problem before could really generate some new and novel solutions. And that has definitely been helpful for me in my career. Again, I don't get to zap brains anymore. There's no non-invasive brain stimulation, but I mentioned that I've done sports analytics things. Sports statistics translate really nicely to like business metaphors, but also methodologically, if you're trying to like look at performance against a typical player or an average or something like that. Like a lot of the methodologies I learned looking at sports data are very, very useful in business context. So I think like, yeah, your skill sets translate academics. You should totally consider doing this. You can hear how enthusiastic I get when I'm talking about it. So very
Yeah,
excited.
yeah, no, I believe it. Yeah, so I wanted to go back to, you were talking about, like, evaluating job postings and stuff like that, and, Sylvia's asking, like, how do you, recommend, like, researching different companies? Like, if you're trying to look into, like, a company you might wanna apply to, do you have any, like, tips and tricks for finding out the important information about them?
Totally. So first, companies will almost never say bad things about themselves in their like public postings and stuff like that. So I think you'll probably have to dig a little bit deeper than kind of any PR materials that organizations are going to put out because they'll always put themselves in the best light, which makes sense. That seems fair. Uh, so other kind of secondary ways that you can look into this is kind of I use LinkedIn pretty regularly to see if I know anybody who works at an organization. And usually I don't know that someone directly, but I have a friend of a friend. And like, I don't know. Initially, I felt like it was an imposition asking someone to make an introduction so that I could ask questions about an organization. But then people did that to me a lot, and it seemed like it was totally cool to have those conversations. So then I started doing it. And so, like, I think it's totally reasonable to reach out to people that are at organizations that you're interested in and ask if they have 5 minutes or if you can buy them a cup of coffee. They should not accept you buying them a cup of coffee. That could be a bribe. But in any case, it's totally reasonable, I think, to reach out to people. Um, I can't think of any like this is the right job posting board or the right company evaluation uh, like website that would give you better or like the best evaluations, because what you see on a lot of those sites is very angry people will post negative reviews about an organization, and it's hard to know. Like everyone has at least a few bad experiences, and so yeah, you don't want to necessarily take those as like your primary source of truth if you can avoid them. Uh, and I think it's also one thing I learned at other organizations is that sometimes the organization asks employees to write nice reviews about that organization, which feels a little icky, but again, like just another reason to be very critical about the kinds of reviews that you're reading that are kind of in officially sanctioned areas that you're probably going to get a lot of biases there. Talking to someone is almost always the best bet.
That makes sense. Yeah. So kind of jumping back to, interviewing and all that, 'cause I know that you've, interviewed and hired a lot of different people. What's one question that people get wrong a lot of the time that you wish that you could, tell them about?
Oh, do you have any questions? It's astonishing to me how many people don't have any questions at all.
Yeah.
Um, just
Love
have a question, just one question.
that.
Um, most of the questions that I'm asking for, or where like they don't necessarily like have an obvious right or wrong answer, but like the non-responses are almost always a wrong answer. So like if I ask, do you
Mm.
have any questions? Like having no questions, it's a little bit of a warning sign. Like if it's the case where, oh, I guess another one is, can you think of an example where you could have done something better? And a candidate says, nope, can't think of any of those. Like that's a little bit of a red flag for me too, and that happens sometimes. Again, like I definitely understand that people get nervous and on the spot. Like I've definitely had some weird answers on job interviews of my own before because I was nervous. You can tell by how quickly I'm talking, I get nervous easily. But at the same time, like it, having a couple of questions prepared beforehand that are just generic in case your mind blanks questions are useful, and having a couple of like cases where you did something that maybe you could have done better
Mm.
are useful too, because those like it seems weird to not be able to think about those sorts of things.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a tricky one, like what, something that you could have done better. But yeah, we also get a question in the chat about questions that you wish people would ask, maybe some more specific ones that you thought were really good questions.
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's see. So one that I ask a lot that I wish people would ask more is kind of about the like what people who have come before have done, and so like what people
Mm,
have been in that role previously, and what they could have done differently. So I guess yeah, let me amend that. It's more of the what people could have done differently to be more successful in those roles. So I guess like I want people to be able to kind of think about what if scenarios, like what if this thing had happened, what would you have done differently? What if this thing had happened, what did you have done differently? Um, and I think the first step to be able to like act well in those situations is to be able to kind of think about those situations. And so sometimes coming up with those sorts of questions as part of a discussion and kind of a conversation in an interview could be a sign that you're thinking clearly and critically about kind of the potential things that you could be coming up with or confronted with in that role. Um, I don't feel satisfied with my answer to that, so I'm going to think more on this. I'll follow up if I come up with anything better, but that was a good question.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so one thing I was also kind of following the same thread. So like let's say that, you're breaking into the industry, you have some personal projects, but you come across like these unicorn postings or, ones that are, entry level but have like 10 years of experience. What are some ways to in the interview kind of make up for those weaknesses or those lacks of experience?
Yeah, that's a fair question. So again, I think the first thing to do with those sorts of postings is if they're looking for something that feels impossible, that's probably something to move on from. But I also will say it's useful to get practice interviewing, even for roles that you don't necessarily have like an expectation that it's going to turn into something. Um,
Mhm.
Interviewing is a skill that you get better at with practice. So taking interviews with companies that don't even necessarily feel like you're really that strongly, or maybe feel like it might be one of these impossible scenarios, like isn't necessarily a bad idea. It's just good to go into these things sort of eyes wide open. But I think again, like if someone is looking for particular experience in like a problem area or a domain area, and they're looking for experience that's relevant or germane, um, being able to articulate what you did and then quickly getting to why that fits into the mold, or what is relevant to the role, I think is the thing that you want to do. Is the strategy to take there, right? So, talking about something that that isn't maybe exactly relevant, and talking at length about it will probably make the hiring manager squint their eyes and wrinkle their nose a little bit and say, "All right, get to the point." Um,
Mhm.
Maybe not, but in a lot of those cases, like if you're really if you're able to make the connection quickly, or even make the connection first and then talk about like, hey, this might not seem relevant, but I'll get to the point quickly, then that might be a reasonable strategy that you can take there. Well, that's also a
Sounds
good
good.
question.
Yeah, some solid advice there. We also got a question kind of going back to these different like job titles and all that. VJ's asking like the difference between like data analyst, business integrated analyst, and all these different roles that are out there. What are some kind of different skills that are involved in those roles?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it can vary so much from organization to organization. And in a lot
Mhm.
of cases, you'll see things like business data science, data analyst, like where it just seems like they're appending different titles onto each other to make something seem even more impressive or inflated. Um, I guess some kind of general rules or things that I've noticed is that analysts are almost always going to be working in non-code, so using more GUI based sorts of tools, so like drag and drop things in their BI
Gotcha.
sorts of tools. So like a Tableau or a Looker or a Power BI seems to be kind of more the primary skill set for analyst positions. And that seems to be the case for analyst positions, regardless of like the specificity of it. So, like a business data analyst versus a marketing data analyst versus a data science data analyst, like they all still seem like I think that the applicability of that statement is fair for all of those, that you'll probably be using those tools more often. And then seeing like figuring out the distinction between like a business data analyst versus a business intelligence analyst versus a business data analyst. Um, it's hard to come up with any kind of a general rule, I think, to differentiate between them. So I guess my advice there is like really dig into the job position role, and if it's something that you're on the fence about, again, like getting interview practice is a useful thing to do anyways, and you can ask questions about that in the first interview. But you can also reach out to the recruiter or hiring manager if somebody's listed on LinkedIn, just to ask if you think like, hey, does this like how does this differ from this other thing? And in some cases, it might not. And in because organizations can be large sometimes, and it may be that someone in one part of the organization is hiring for a skill set that they didn't necessarily interface with a recruiter in another part of the organization, and they're basically hiring the same thing but with different titles associated with it. Um, this happens. Ask questions, I think, is the best thing you can do in those cases.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Yeah, so you're mentioning in interviews how, you look for these like transferable skills and projects, communication skills, but beyond kind of that first interview, like in terms of maybe take homes or technical interviews, what do you kind of really look for there for kind of standout skill sets? Or like do you usually give take homes? Like what's your strategy with that?
Yeah. So I definitely like using kind of skill evaluation tools, TakeHomes. I prefer TakeHomes over kind of on-site or kind of during the interview sorts of evaluations, especially if there's coding involved, because people can get nervous during test situations. Interview situations are already really high stress. I recognize that sometimes that can be like better depending on logistics of the interview and kind of the things that they're testing for. So I don't have like a strong like never do during interview coding or during interview skill tests and always do take homes. But my experience has usually been better with the take home just from an evaluation perspective. The exercises that I've tried to design, or the folks that I've worked with have tried to design, have ideally been targeted toward like what someone's actually going to do on the job. So, like a previous organization, we thought that kind of junior data science candidates would be kind of helping to kind of debug broken code a lot and kind of make kind of incremental changes to code, whereas senior data scientist candidates should be able to start kind of build something from scratch and then explain it to different audiences. And so the junior data scientist exercise was here's some broken code, fix it, and then get back to us. And then the senior data scientist exercise was here's some data and a problem, approach that and or come up with a solution and get back to us. We would also, I think, some of the most useful hiring exercises I've used had time constraints built into them, not because they were necessarily situations where I wanted to see how someone was performing under pressure, but because it opened the door to the sorts of counterfactual questions that I mentioned earlier, like well, what if you had done this a different way, or what if you had unlimited time to do this, or say this wrinkle happened in the data, what would happen then? So those are really the sorts of things that I like to have like conversations around. I think it's important to call out like Etsy and a lot of organizations now have really pushed toward having more standardized interview processes in an effort to really debias the process. Like there's tons and tons and tons and tons of good research that interviewing and hiring has been historically biased toward people like me, unfortunately. And so there are definitely tools and approaches that we can use to remove as much bias from that as possible, right? And so like one of the things that we've talked a lot about on my team for hiring exercises lately is like the hiring exercise that we offer for candidates. It can take a while, and we know that not everyone can afford 8 hours or 4 hours of uninterrupted time. And so like how is that impacting kind of the candidates that we're able to evaluate because they have the ability to actually complete those sorts of evaluations during the funnel? So without getting too far deep down the tangent, I guess, to get back to the original question of like, what am I looking for in these data exercises? It really depends on the structure of the particular exercise. Like right now, the one we use for most for candidates is, since we're analyzing experimental data, here's some experimental data. Analyze it, tell us what's in it, and then we'll talk about it in the interview. But if it was something where, again, like we needed them to fix code or build something from scratch, that's what we would want. So if you're, I guess, a takeaway here is if you're getting these data science exercises that feel more like grad school homework assignments than something relevant to the work you're actually going to do, that's probably a red flag that they're not necessarily like sure exactly how they're going to be implementing you, or at the very least that it's a pretty new hiring process or a new team that maybe is still kind of figuring things out, which may not be the end of the world, but good data point to have. That was a long answer. I'm sorry about
That was a good answer,
Good
though.
answer.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thanks.
good things to keep in mind. Yeah, and also kind of along those same lines, Macy was asking about standing out as a candidate. You already mentioned like, networking, kind of reaching out to people in the company, but what are your thoughts on like certificates or like degrees? Is that something that, really adds bonus points? And are there like certificates that are, I guess worth the time and effort to get in terms of like standing out in that applicant pool?
Yeah, that's a pretty common question. So, my experience with folks who have kind of terminal certificates in data science or analytics, when I say like that was what they were getting, not something they got along the way toward a larger degree or a longer degree. Um,
Mhm.
in most cases, have not necessarily had the skill sets that I've been looking for the candidates that I've like for the roles that I've been looking for. And there have also been kind of some consistent patterns where like they'll all often have the same GitHub repo. So candidates from a particular program will all have like a GitHub repo that was all initialized the same way following the class that taught them how to do that. And then they'll all have like the same 6 or 7 repos within their own repo, like with toy data sets from R and Python that they analyzed specific ways that were from a textbook. And I mean, I appreciate that that's a useful way to acquire skills. I just think like for for roles where I'm looking for someone who has more senior level skills, I don't know that the certification programs necessarily imbue those as much as having maybe a certification plus some additional real world experience, or maybe experience in like a graduate program or research focused graduate program where they're full-time researching.
Mm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, so another question I was going to ask is, because you've had like a lot of different, roles, different places, and all this different experience. What are some like big differences in kind of the day-to-day things that you're doing and things that you think that like, applicants should know before they apply different roles, in terms of like, just daily responsibilities, the languages that they're going to be using the most, and things like that.
Um, yeah, that's a good question. So when I think about like what folks are going to be doing day to day, actually, can you rephrase that? I'm not sure if I'm totally grabbing the question. Can you say that one more
Yeah,
time? I'm
sure.
sorry.
Sorry. Yeah. So in terms of like, your experience in different roles and all that, like what's something that applicants should be thinking about in terms of like the day-to-day responsibilities? Like let's say like an analyst versus like a data scientist, is one of them
Gotcha.
maybe more Python or SQL focused or Tableau focused even, and like,
Gotcha.
what's
Gotcha.
that?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Thank you very much for the clarification there. So, a common thing that I get asked in interviews is, "What's the average day like for a data scientist?" And my stock response is, "Well, the average is a terrible indicator of what any given day is going to be in the career of a
Okay.
data professional, right?" So, on any given day, you may like so. I think it's usually more project based than maybe like like and it's going to vary by the organization as well, but so there will be projects where you spend several weeks playing with SQL because you're trying to figure out how to get your data structured or pulled from the sources that you need to actually start doing things with it, and then after you've gotten that part figured out enough to actually start building the next phase in Python or R or whatever other tool you're working with. Um, it's not like you stop working on the SQL part. You then have to kind of continuously refactor that as you're working through the next steps in your pipeline or whatever you're working on. And so, like, I guess the way that I think about it is that projects will often start more with like strategic and non-technical things and then incrementally start building the technical things onto it, but it doesn't pull anything off the plate at any point in the project. So you're consistently just adding more things on top until the project's done, then you shift back into the strategic mode. um, and in terms of how that varies from analyst to data scientist, I don't know that I necessarily see the variability that much on kind of like analyst to data scientist. It's usually more like organization to organization. Like big organizations will typically not involve the analysts and the data scientists or the junior folks in maybe more of the strategic side, and so their day to day is more like actually implementing the strategic decisions.
Mhm.
Whereas at smaller organizations where maybe you're forced to wear many hats or kind of everybody has to do lots of different things, then you may be more engaged with the strategic stuff, regardless of your seniority level. So
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. And by the way, we have time for like one or two more questions, so feel free to drop those in the chat if there's anything, pressing that you'd like to hear from Jim. We got one about kind of following up on what you're talking about, like how GitHub is like important to, evaluating a candidate and looking at that. Is there any like major green flags that you look for in a GitHub repo that really make a candidate stand out compared to other ones?
oh, that's a great question. So anything beyond just kind of the stock GitHub setup. So some sign that you've paid attention to putting together a repo. A README, oh gosh, people who have
Mm,
READMEs for their repo,
yeah.
that warms my heart. Folks, make READMEs for your repos. And if you see my repos, they don't all have READMEs, so I should take my own
Yeah.
advice. I think it's less the green flags and more the red flags, which are empty repos, or repos that are just copy pastes of things that people have done before them. Like, I don't necessarily take that as a people trying to pass things off as their own work, as much as like, this isn't something that shows me what you've done. But yeah, anything you can do to make it easier for someone to quickly get the point of what's in your code in that repo, and maybe figure out how to use it, which is often like entailed in a nice README file. That will make it much easier for me to like consume it and have good questions about it.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. And one last question, Yvette was asking kind of like for do you have any maybe suggestions for projects that are kind of top of your mind in terms of stuff that people could get started on, or like maybe data sets that like you recommend people look into for their personal projects?
Oh, absolutely. So I live in Chicago. Chicago and a lot of other cities have public data portals. I'm
Mm,
forgetting the URL for Chicago's off the top of my head, but if you Google city data portal, you'll probably get a link to whatever that city's data is. And publicly available data sets have awesome data. So in Chicago, for example, there is data on public transportation ridership by stop. There's data on public official salaries. I made a little dashboard of 311 requests, which are service requests for various public services. So you can see like where trees were getting planted or where coyotes were being sighted. So public data sets from municipalities, so cities, states, countries. The census has awesome fun data that you can play with. Census data is also really useful because folks have done so much with census data. So you can often find really helpful tutorials on how to interact with census data. I love sports data, and sports data is sometimes freely available. Sometimes it's available in very curated, proprietary, expensive formats, but you can find plenty of free stuff out there that's useful to play with. And it's usually nicely structured, which is what makes it, I think, really useful as kind of data sets to learn from. Um, I love using the R programming language, and R
mhm.
has there's a Twitter hashtag RTidy Tuesday, where every Tuesday there is a repository released that folks make data visualizations from, and so that there's free data sets there, and again, lots of other folks that are working with them for tips and tricks. Gosh, there's a lot out there, but I think that's probably a good list to get folks started.
It's a
Yeah,
great
that's a lot.
list.
Those are some great resources right there. Yeah, sorry, Scott, you're saying something?
Oh, that's a really thorough list.
Yeah, a lot to explore there. But yeah, so we're right about time. If I'm sure there's more questions for Jim, Jim's LinkedIn is in the event link, so feel free to reach out there, ask any more questions. This will also be streaming on YouTube, so if you want to rewatch and maybe catch some of those data sets he just mentioned, some of his tips, yeah, you can go ahead and do that. And go ahead and give our page a like if you want to be notified of like future events. We talk to some amazing people just like Jim and get a lot of great tips in the industry. So yeah, we'd love to have you back. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Jim, especially for answering all our questions. And yeah, everyone have a great Wednesday.